Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Anna and this video is going to be all about the mistakes I've made or sometimes still make when making sourdough bread. It's another video in my sourdough series. I've already done 3 other videos, one on general lessons I've learned in the process, another one on my sourdough bread recipe, and then the last one is like a complete beginner's guide to sourdough starter. And people seem to be interested in those videos, so I thought let's do another one. So I've got 3 things on my list for you. I will of course talk about the mistake itself, but then also how to fix it. And then at the end, I'll share a little bonus one, which is more of a laughing story. I don't think anyone has ever had that happen to them, so listen to the end for that one. And just to clarify before we get started, even though I've made all of these mistakes and they are mistakes in my opinion, they still produce bread that we end up eating. It's not like the bread just went into the waste bin or something. It's just there is a difference between good bread and great bread. So all of these things that I'll talk about, they produce bread of lesser quality, let's say. It's more about the taste and the look of the bread as well. So that's just to be clear, like even if you do these things, do these mistakes, it's not like you will have no bread at the end. All right, mistake number 1 is overproofing the bread. This is something that happens to me more times than I would like to admit. I think I've gotten better at managing it, but it still happens, and in a bit I'll talk about why. So basically what this is when you let the bread sit at room temperature for too long. Now, it's not like there is a specific time that you only can let the bread sit at room temperature for an hour or 2 hours, and then at exactly 2 hours you need to bake it or put it in the fridge or do something with it. So it is really difficult to judge when the bread has proved to the exactly correct point, which is also why I feel like that's why I still do this every now and then. But so basically what then happens when the bread overproofed is the dough gets very sticky, and when you bake the bread, it's a lot more flat. It doesn't puff up as nicely. Now, one thing I also have to say here is I'm 95% sure that this is what's happening to my bread when it's sticky and it doesn't puff up. I'm 95% sure it's because it has overproofed. The 5% is left there because I'm still not a super experienced bread maker, but based on all the materials and things I have seen and I have read, this is how I have estimated to myself that that's what's happening. Now, if you have seen my bread recipe, I talk about the entire process and how I have it set up and how I do it. And when I stick to that process, I have no problem with it. And I'm specifically talking about the part where I mix all the flour and the sourdough starter, and then I do my stretch and folds a couple times, and then I put the bread into the proofing basket and immediately put it in the fridge. Now, my time schedule for that, I have some very specific time schedule, which if I follow it, I'm all good. And I talked in that video as well about like you don't have to precisely do 20 minutes between each stretch and fold, but what happens is I sometimes forget to set the timer on my phone and I just forget about the bread. And this happens very easily because I'll just go do some work on my computer, or maybe me and little Sarah are going outside to the playground. I forget to set the timer, and all of a sudden, instead of 20 minutes, it's sitting there for an hour. And that's already quite a big difference. So whenever that happens, those tend to be the times when I overproof the bread, because then what I tend to think is, oh, but I still have to do these 2 or 3 more stretch and folds before I can put it into the proofing basket and into the fridge. And so I do more, even though I probably just should put it in the proofing basket and be done with it. And like, as I make more of these, as I get more experience, I think I'm more able to tell when the bread has proofed enough. And this is, I believe, also something I've mentioned in the bread recipe video. Basically, when you have your bread dough in your bowl, and when you start seeing bubbles on top of the bread, that's when it's getting there. So if, let's say, they first appear in your third stretch and fold, you do one more, and then like, you know for sure that it's ready, it's proofed, because the next time you will see even more of them. The dough will start rising, like you can clearly see that it's just more fluffy, there is more air in it, it's yeah, again, rising, there is bubbles, it's ready to go into the proofing basket. And so my advice on how to correct this mistake would be what I said before: stick to a schedule. So put the timer on your phone. If you're having issues with it, put the timer on your phone. That way you just won't run into these issues. And one more thing I want to mention here is that the temperature is a really big factor here. So usually this overproofing happens, at least to me, in the summer. In the summer, when in the kitchen it's not much, it's a couple degrees hotter than the rest of the year, but those couple degrees are enough to make a difference in how fast the dough is rising and fermenting and doing all of that. So that's something to keep in mind. So it's even more important in the summer to stick to some kind of a schedule so that you don't overproof your bread. And as far as I understand, it is also possible to underproof your bread, meaning it hasn't had enough time at room temperature, but I don't think that has ever happened to me. And I guess, again, I'm maybe also just not experienced enough to be able to recognize if that happens. So maybe it has and I just don't know about it, but I'm pretty sure it has not. As far as I know, the result would be the same. Like, the bread wouldn't rise up in the oven, it wouldn't be as pretty, and like the taste would of course be a little bit different as well. So it really is about a balance. Like, you want it to be proofed just enough. But again, I want to make it clear that that just enough window is pretty large. It's not like it's exactly 1 hour or exactly 2 hours after you've added your starter or something like that. But again, I have found it very helpful to keep a timer on my phone. And I know that if I like do 5 minutes more or 10 minutes more, it's not a huge issue, but just doing 40 minutes extra is not the way to go. And I'm thinking that maybe with the underproofing, the reason why that has never happened to me is because I do the long fermentation in the fridge. So once again, I put my bread in the bread basket, I put it in the fridge overnight, and I bake it the next day in the morning usually. So it has like 8+, maybe 10+ hours in the fridge where the fermentation process is slowed down, but it is still happening. I can definitely see a difference in what the dough looks like the night when I'm putting it in, and then in the morning. I can clearly see that it has risen further. So maybe that's why underproofing is not really an issue for me. All right, moving on to mistake number 2, and that is using the wrong flour. And I specifically put wrong in quotations because there is no such thing as only one right flour to make bread. But I'll get to that a little bit later. So first of all, the mistake, or how I know that it was a mistake, is the taste of the bread in the end. That's the main issue that I have, but also sometimes the rising of the bread in the oven. So again, if you've seen some of the previous sourdough videos, then you know that I said in those videos that in my experience, the easiest kind of flour to make bread with is all-purpose. I have never had issues when I've used only all-purpose flour. The bread has always risen nicely and the taste was good. Now, good is not great. So I don't like the all-purpose only flour as much as some of the mixtures that I make. So I don't like it because to me it tastes very bland, like very simple. So I do like to add some different flours into it. I think the best combination I was able to make was all-purpose. Out of the total 360 grams of the flour that I add, I do 300 of the all-purpose and then 60 grams of whole wheat all-purpose flour. So it's the same type of, well, it's wheat flour, right? So wheat flour, either I guess the all-purpose, the one that's purely white, or and then combine it with whole grain wheat flour. So that one is a lot more coarse and it's brown. I found that combination just makes the bread super tasty, at least to me. So the issue there then is the taste gets fixed, but then we get to the problem of the rising of the bread in the oven again. So with the all-purpose, that's the best result. As soon as I add too much of the wrong flour, here, that's why the quotations, the bread doesn't rise as much. So I had to find that good balance where I'm getting a better taste, but also the same rising quality. So I have tried in the past as well making bread with only whole wheat, and it was super flat and the taste wasn't great either. We still ate it, but it was definitely not a great bread. Now, that could have also been because I'm just not, again, a super experienced baker. So I feel like if I knew more about all the factors that go into it, I would be able to make a well-risen bread even with flour that's not just the plain white all-purpose. Because I feel like if I knew exactly how to know that a bread has proofed well and to add just the right amount of water or something, like I would be able to make that work. I don't know, that's just my feeling, but I haven't done any testing. But maybe again, with more time, as I try to practice these things more, I will be able to make really nice, well-risen and well-tasting bread from all kinds of flours. So in addressing this mistake, as I have said, what I found works best for me is using majority of the flour for the bread, all-purpose, plain old white all-purpose, and then just a smaller portion to add some different kind of flour, whether that's the whole wheat flour or maybe whole rye flour is something I've tried as well, or just different kinds of flour that are going to give the bread a more complex taste. Mistake number 3 is only about the taste, and that is not adding enough salt and cumin. Now, this is something for which I've only had to do a couple test runs and I figured it out. I don't make this mistake again. And I think this should be the same for everyone else as well. Like once you figure out the measurements that you want to use, you're good to go as long as you just repeat those. So what I did with my very first bread that I made on my own is I added only the salt because I was thinking that, like in theory, I hate cumin. I really dislike it when I can taste it. And like when I bite into the cumin seed, that's like one of the worst things that can happen to me while eating. But apparently I'm too maybe accustomed to the taste of it. So I was actually missing it when the bread didn't have any of it at all. Because here in the Czech Republic, our bread typically contains quite a lot of cumin in it. So my second bread, I knew I had to add at least a little bit, otherwise it was again just super bland and it just wasn't tasty for me. So I added that, and then with the salt, the recipe I used in the very beginning contained, I want to say the recipe had half of the salt that I actually add today. So it was, again, like just maybe to my taste, you know, I'm used to foods that are more salty maybe, I don't know. So I needed to add a little bit more to it. And today, and again, if you've seen my bread video, then you know I measure the salt very precisely, like to the single grams of how much I'm adding. And I know that, you know, like plus or minus 1 gram, I'm still fine, but it really should be that very precise measurement. And so measuring fixes this mistake right away. So when I think about all of these 3 mistakes that I've mentioned, they really are about a balance, I feel like. It's very clear with the salt and the cumin or whatever other spice you will be using. Like if you don't add any at all, it's going to be super bland. You're not going to like that. But also if you add too much, nobody's going to want to eat that either. So you just have to find the right balance of the spices that you want to use. But again, like I said, once you find it, it just means that you have to keep measuring it or just adding that same amount, and you should always have the same result. With the flour, it's again, similar thing. You just need to find the right balance for you. Maybe you are going to like an all-purpose bread just on its own. So just the all-purpose flour and bread made out of that just on its own. If you won't, then again, it's about finding the right balance by trying to add a little bit more of some different flour. And then obviously the first one, I've already talked quite a bit about that, is about the balance between underproofing and overproofing your bread. And in order to find all this balance, you will have to try this out. Like you are just going to have a couple of runs. I mean, at this point, I have done probably over 120, 150 breads maybe. And especially that first one, I'm still figuring out. And even that second one, I'm still trying different kinds of flours to see what I'm going to like the best. So it's just something that you have to go into. If you want to start bread making, you have to go into it knowing that there will be some fails along the journey, or at least some lessons learned, things that you will have to adjust. It's not going to be like the most amazing bread the very first time you will make it, or it might be, and then the second one won't be as amazing because something will change, like that balance will shift and it won't be as great as the first one. And only over time, if you make bread over and over and over again, you will learn what works for you the best. I hope that this helps as an encouragement for you to make bread. It's the most delicious thing in the world, in my opinion. So I would definitely encourage you to make some. And now for my embarrassing story. But basically my mistake number 4 is not using baking paper. So when I was baking bread some months ago, I realized I ran out of baking paper, and it was in the morning. The oven was already preheated. I just couldn't run out into the shop to get some. What I did have at home is something we call here snack paper. Now, I have, again, just very little understanding of the difference between snack paper and baking paper, but they're not the same. And I've learned the hard way. So I've used this snack paper, which looks almost exactly like baking paper, at least to the touch. It's just that it's white. And I've used it to bake the bread, and it completely and totally stuck to the bottom of the bread. and I was not able to pull this out in any way. But luckily, it's just such a very thin paper that we were able to eat it anyways. I mean, I just cut off the very bottom of the bread and it was fine to eat, but I was just like, what a dumb idea. So anyways, that's just for some entertainment. I hope nobody makes that mistake. Clearly, I've only been using baking paper since then. And that concludes today's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.